My viewers are most likely familiar with the story of Robin Hood, and in most modern tellings of the story, King Richard the First, the Lionheart, is a hero of the story who, upon returning from the Crusades, puts an end to the deprivations of his rapacious brother John. Some even add the detail that Richard was being held for ransom, and John, in various ways, is trying to prevent the payment of that ransom in order to remain king. Like all legends, the story is a mix of some historical fact and an awful lot of fiction, but one thing is often left out of the story, that one of the reasons that Richard was being held for ransom had to do with the murder of another king. We don't know all that much about Conrad of Montferrat. We just know that his death came by murder most foul. It is a medieval murder mystery that deserves to be remembered. Jerusalem is an ancient city, with evidence of settlement at least as far back as 5,000 years. The fertile area at the crossroads of the Mediterranean has been held and conquered many times, and the walled city besieged by numerous empires. The city first came under Muslim rule after it was taken by the first caliphate from the Byzantines in 637 or 638. Reported threats to Christian pilgrims by the Seljuk Empire in the 11th century resulted in the First Crusade, a religious war initiated by Pope Urban II to retake the Holy Land. Jerusalem was taken by siege by the armies of the First Crusade from the Fatimid Caliphate in 1099, leading to the slaughter of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants and creating the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem. A leader in the crusade, Godfrey of Boulogne, was made leader of the city, although he did not choose the title king. Godfrey died only a year later in 1100, by some accounts of sickness and by another of falling in battle. He died without an heir and was replaced by his brother Baldwin, who was the first leader of the kingdom to use the title king. Thereafter, the succession was decided by a group called the High Court of Jerusalem, a council of leading lords, although the council tended to favor blood relatives of the previous king. Thus, rulership was somewhat hereditary. Conflict with the Muslim world continued, although alliances often shifted, and various Crusader factions sometimes allied with different Muslim factions. The Crusader orders, the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar, formed to defend the kingdom and protect pilgrims. With the aid of Europe, the kingdom grew, notably capturing the ancient city of Tyre in 1124. There was also internal conflict, as the kingdom still depended upon support from Europe and different factions vied for control. Baldwin I died without an heir and was replaced by his cousin, Baldwin II. Baldwin II died without a son and so left the throne to his daughter Melisende, who married a French count named Fulk, making him king. The imposition of a foreign king brought revolt among the native Crusader nobles. Moreover, Fulk was Count of Anjou, the grandfather of the future King Henry II of England, thus tying the kingdom to the Angevin dynasty. The kingdom faced a succession crisis during the reign of Baldwin IV, Fulk's grandchild, crowned in 1174. Baldwin suffered from leprosy, which, although not preventing him from ruling and fighting, did prevent him from marrying or having children. He spent much of his reign trying to groom an heir. Here the succession gets even more confusing. Baldwin IV had two half-sisters, Sibylla and Isabella. Sibylla, being the oldest, was made heir to the throne. She was wed to William of Montferrat. The Marquess of Montferrat were related to both the kings of France and the Holy Roman Empire. They had a son, also named Baldwin. But William died of a fever while Sibylla was still pregnant. At just 20 years old, the princess was the key to the throne, and machinations over who she would marry began immediately. The story is, unsurprisingly, convoluted. There was a quick move to force her marriage to a Jerusalem nobleman, Baldwin of Ibelin. As confusing as the number of Baldwins were, this was perceived as potential by Baldwin IV as an attempted coup, and Sibylla was quickly married to another nobleman who had recently arrived in the Holy Land, the relatively unknown Guy of Lusignan. However, the contemporary chronicle of Ernol suggests another simple possibility. Possibly the young Sibylla was simply seduced by Guy. Guy was of the House of Lusignan, which was in Poitou, part of the Angevin dynasty and vassals of the King of England, Henry II, and then his son Richard I. But Guy proved to be unpopular among both the barons of Jerusalem and the kings of the other Crusader states. Fearing a crisis, and with multiple claimants to the throne, the leper king held a council and settled upon his 6-year-old nephew, Baldwin, son of Sibylla and William. Baldwin was named Baldwin V and made co-ruler of Jerusalem. When Baldwin IV died in 1185, Baldwin V became king, and Count Raymond of Tripoli, another Crusader state, was made regent. This was significant. As historian Helena P. Schrader writes, the fact that Tripoli was made regent with the consent of the High Court and the Count of Edessa was made the boy's guardian are both indications of the intensity of the animosity and suspicion the bishops and barons of Jerusalem harbored for Guy of Lusignan by this time. But the young king suffered from ill health and died in 1186. Rumors of treachery were widespread, but Sibylla acted quickly and claimed the throne. Her husband was still unpopular, and the Jerusalem nobility only allowed her ascension if she annulled her marriage to Guy, a stipulation to which she agreed only if she was allowed to marry the man of her choice. She dutifully annulled her marriage, ascended the throne, and then chose to remarry Guy. The decision was so reviled that the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem refused to crown Guy. Sibylla chose to crown him herself. Despite opposition from virtually everyone but his apparently loyal wife and one important noble, Reynaud of Chantillon, lord of the fiefdom of Haute-Jourdain, machinations had made Guy of Lusignan king of Jerusalem in 1186. It was a development that would drastically affect the kingdom. Under Baldwin IV and the regency of Raymond, an uneasy peace had been held with the Muslim caliphates. But Reynaud chose to provoke war, first by attempting a disastrously failed attack on Mecca, and then by taking the sister of the great Seljuk Turk general Saladin prisoner. It isn't clear what Guy's role was in these decisions, but he was at least unable to rein Reynaud in. Less than a year later, Guy would lead the Crusader armies to a devastating defeat at the July 1187 Battle of Hattin. Again, historians disagree as to exactly how responsible Guy was for the defeat. While many, including Raymond of Tripoli, argued that he should seek peace and avoid confrontation, Guy sought battle, possibly because he was overconfident and headstrong, and possibly because he didn't trust Raymond. The Crusader army held a strong position at the village of Sepphoris, where they had an ample water supply. Yet Saladin managed to tempt Guy to lead his army on a chase, taking them away from their water supply. Some describe this tactic as a brilliant move by Saladin, others as a devastating tactical blunder by Guy, and yet others portray Guy as a victim of circumstance. He certainly had headstrong leaders, including Reynaud, pushing him to attack. He also had been given a substantial sum by King Richard I of England, and perhaps felt that he had to secure victory. In any case, the Crusader army, exhausted by thirst and fighting on the ground of Saladin's choosing, was devastated. Historian Kelly DeVries wrote in 2007, on 4 July 1187, the Crusades changed, and the change was felt not only in the Holy Land, but also throughout Syria, Egypt, Byzantium, and Europe. It seemed as if the Christian gods' wheel of fortune had fallen, while the Muslim gods had risen. Guy was captured, his army destroyed. He had left Jerusalem virtually defenseless, although a brief but futile stand was made under the leadership of one of his rivals, Balian of Ibelin. The kingdom was nearly overrun, but a new hero arose. Conrad of Montferrat, the younger brother of Sibyllia's first husband William, was described by a member of the Byzantine court. Of beautiful appearance, comely in life's springtime, exceptional and peerless in manly courage and intelligence, and in the flower of his body's strength. In July of 1187, Conrad came to Jerusalem, apparently intending to join his father on crusade, only to find Jerusalem had fallen. His father was held prisoner, and the Crusader armies were in disarray. He sailed to the last stronghold of Jerusalem, the fortified city of Tyre, where the remnants of the Crusader army had gathered. A contemporary chronicle writes that he arrived in Tyre in time to prevent its commander from surrendering the city. He reorganized the defense and put up such a fight that a Muslim chronicler said of him, he was a devil incarnate in his ability to govern and defend a town, and a man of extraordinary courage. Saladin went looking for easier prey, but returned for a second siege. There, the legend says, Saladin brought out Conrad's father and offered to release him if Conrad surrendered the city. Conrad reportedly said that he would not give one stone of Tyre's walls for his father's life, and saying that he had already lived a long life, pointed a crossbow at his father and threatened to kill him himself. It was a bold move. Saladin was shocked, but his buff called, released the Marquess anyway. Tyre was saved. Meanwhile, the defeat at Hattin raised a furor throughout Europe, which called for another crusade. The Third Crusade was led by powerful kings, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, although Frederick himself died on his way to the Holy Land. The Crusaders won some victories and reconquered a part of the kingdom, but not Jerusalem. And again the kingdom needed a king. Saladin released Guy in 1188, and he came to Tyre demanding that Conrad recognize him as king. Conrad refused, referring to the will of Baldwin IV that Kings Henry II and Philip were to choose the next king. The method that Sibyl and Guy had used to claim the throne had come back to haunt them. Then Sibylla died of an illness in 1189, and Conrad and his supporters convinced her younger sister Isabella to divorce her husband and marry Conrad. It was an interesting machination. Conrad was possibly still married himself. He had taken another man's wife, and the marriage was technically illegal under church law since his brother had been married to Isabella's half-sister. Still, possibly because there was so much opposition to Guy, the papal legate sanctioned the marriage. This raised an issue. Richard supported Guy, as Lusignan was a vassal state of Richard. Philip, on the other hand, supported Conrad, his first cousin, once removed. In April 1192, the High Court of Jerusalem met. To Richard's dismay, they unanimously selected Conrad over Guy. Guy purchased the island of Cyprus and ruled there, continuing to use the title king. Then, historian Patrick Williams of the University of Portsmouth wrote in a 1970 edition of the journal Traditio, Studies in Ancient and Medieval History, Thought and Religion, on 28 April 1192, Conrad, Marquess of Montferrat and Lord of Tyre, husband of the last royal princess of Jerusalem and newly elected king of that embattled state, was assassinated. Contemporary chronicles differ in some respects, but what is generally agreed is that Conrad was riding home from dinner with a light escort when two men approached, knocked him from his horse, and fatally wounded him with daggers. They attempted to escape, but one was killed and the other captured by Conrad's guards. Many accounts say that the men were part of the sect called the Order of Assassins, but at least one contemporary account said that the two men were servants of Conrad who had been bribed. Others said that they were servants but had taken the jobs with the purpose of the assassination. Williams writes, it may be taken as established then that the murder of Conrad was accomplished on 28 April 1192 by two men who admitted to being of the sect of the Assassins, and who had therefore been sent to their task by Cinean, the master of the sect. Moreover, the culprits had successfully masqueraded as Christians and had been at least familiar with Conrad for some time, possibly even acting as his servants. Thus, the assassination was apparently planned well in advance. But the question remains, by whom? Some accounts say the surviving men admitted that he had been hired by Richard. It's very plausible. Richard had opposed Conrad, and Conrad was in the process of negotiating with Saladin behind Richard's back. But Williams notes that the chronicle making that claim was written by a member of Saladin's court, and may have been covering for another prime suspect. Saladin, knowing his reputation and not wanting decisive leadership for the kingdom, may have had Conrad killed. But there were other suspects as well. Had Guy, having just lost to his rival, hired the assassins? Could it have been Humphrey of Tyrone, Isabella's former husband? Or had the leader of the assassins, Cinean, had his own reasons to kill Conrad? Williams discounts Humphrey, who had little to gain and was not known for his initiative, and Guy, who had apparently accepted his fate and made little protest to his loss. While Cinean had ordered the attack, his reason for doing so himself is questionable. A letter presented in 1193 suggests that Conrad had insulted Cinean when he captured a boat of assassins, but the letter was what Williams calls an obvious forgery. And if Cinean had reason to kill Conrad, why wait for years until he was elected king? Williams notes that Saladin also makes little sense, as he was in negotiation with Conrad and was known to be hostile to the Guild of Assassins and unlikely to use them. But there's also a case that Richard would not have used assassins, as it would have gone against his sense of honor, and he likely would have just simply challenged Conrad himself. Moreover, he was planning to return to England, and it's unlikely at that time that he was interested in upsetting the proverbial apple cart. Williams suggested another candidate, Henry II of Champagne. Henry was a French nobleman, a nephew of both Henry of France and Richard, who had come along with the Third Crusade. Henry had been sent by Richard to inform Conrad that he had been elected king. Williams writes, on Tuesday, 28 April, Conrad was killed. By Thursday, Henry had arrived back in Tyre, been unanimously recognized as the person fit to succeed Conrad as king, and had been persuaded to marry Conrad's pregnant widow, Isabella. Williams argues that it is suspicious that Henry, who had left Tyre, found out about Conrad's assassination before Richard, almost as if he knew it was coming. Further suspicion comes because Henry paid a visit to the mountain stronghold of the Assassins in 1194. Was he there to pay a debt? Still, Williams concludes, it is admitted that the case against Henry is far from conclusive. It is, however, suggestive of at least as tenable as the case against any of the others. Richard continued the crusade, but failed to take Jerusalem. The continued existence of a reduced kingdom of Jerusalem was guaranteed by a 3-year truce in the 1192 Treaty of Jaffa, negotiated between Richard and Saladin. In a bizarre twist, Henry died, falling out of a window in 1197. The long-suffering Isabella married a fourth time to Aymery of Lusignan, Guy's brother, who would replace Guy as Lord of Cyprus after his death in 1194. I know this is all rather confusing. There are too many people with the same names, enough machinations for a season of Game of Thrones, and a murder mystery with multiple suspects, none of whom are still around to be interrogated. Sometimes history is like that. It can be difficult to unravel, and sometimes mysteries remain a mystery, even more than 800 years later. And what do we really know about Conrad? In fiction and film, he's often been portrayed as something of a villain, but Mariana Gilchrist of Hull University notes that the historical description of Conrad has been tainted by Anglo-Angevin chronicle and romance traditions that are favorable to Richard I. Is it possible that instead of being a villain, that he was actually a very capable ruler? Had he survived, how might have impacted his kingdom? And one further important thing to note, when Richard was returning home to England, he had to travel in disguise because he had created enmity with both the French and the Holy Roman Empire. When he was finally discovered and held, it was by Leopold V, the Duke of Austria, who happened to be Conrad of Montferrat's first cousin. One of the charges made against Richard at the time was that he had arranged for the murder of Conrad. Guilty or not, Richard took the blame, and England paid the price. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community and locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.